Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. Now, the acting Prosecutor General of Sudan has charged former President Umar al-Bashir for corruption and possessing foreign currency. Bashir was ousted after ruling the North African nation for 30 long years by civil demonstrations that were organized by doctors, by teachers and lawyers, among many others, which erupted over the rising food prices before they morphed into broader demands for political change. Now, this demand for political change reached its apex in December 2018 after years of anger over long-standing corruption and repression of Bashir's government. Currently, the corruption charges Mr. Bashir faces are completely unrelated to his decade-old indictment by the International Criminal Court on charges of genocide, crimes against humanity and war crimes. Now, this makes al-Bashir the only serving head of state in the region to be indicted for war crimes and be serving at the same time. We will be looking at the merits of the skepticism surrounding this trial. Is this an attempt by Sudan's new military rulers to deflect attention from a recent bloody crackdown on protesters, as well as its reluctance to cede power to a civilian-led transitional administration? Or is the Sudanese finally going to see some form of justice? Let's find out from our guests. I'd like to introduce the panel of experts who are joining us. We have Dr. Ahmed McLad, an analyst who's joining us from Sydney, Australia. And also we have with us Mr. Rashid Sidahmed, the Sudanese Communist Party. He's currently located in London. And we have also Dr. Asha El-Karib, an activist, a senior strategic advisor of the two Sudanese Organization for Research and Development. She's joining us from Sudan. I want to start with you, Dr. Asha. First, could you give us a roundup of the ground situation right now in Sudan after former President Umar al-Bashir has heard the charges against him?
Okay, thanks for having me for this program. I would just like to say that the situation in Sudan is still very fluid. And there is a lot of insecurity. We still do not have the civilian government we were hoping for, and that was the reason for actually the demonstration, because the Sudanese people stood against the dictatorship and totalitarian regime of al-Bashir and demanding democratic civilian government. Unfortunately, the military and sorry, I'm trying to translate from Arabic to English.
You're saying the military is
the
not...
militia, the Janjaweed militia.
Okay.
They are very reluctant, and they don't want actually to go ahead with the Sudanese Professional Association and the freedom and change forces to form the government. You know that.
Right.
But
why don't you tell us a little, Dr. Asha, about what the reaction on the street was? There is a lot of skepticism that is being reported from those on the ground, the protesters, that they don't have much confidence in this trial that is about to start for the former president.
And actually, the charges for the president were really very disappointing for the Sudanese people, you know, because we were not against al-Bashir because he was just a corrupt guy, you know. It was because of his type of governance, you know, crimes against humanity, killing people, insecurity, and as you said in the beginning, that he was indicted by the ICC for crimes against humanity, and that is why we think this is just like trying to show the world that there is a sort of justice in Sudan, and we are now taking al-Bashir for accusing him for money laundering.
Right, but is there any kind of ceding in, a reduction in the kind of protests that there were going on in Sudan leading up to this these charges being announced?
No, actually the protests have been stopped before that. You know, I don't know whether you have heard about the massacre that happened to the protesters and they have been killed.
The June 3rd massacre, absolutely. So there has been no result of these charges on the streets as a result. There's been no change on the streets. Is that what you're saying?
Not in the streets, because the streets are now completely taken by the military. We are actually now under a military siege in Sudan.
So the situation is as tense as it was before, following the June 3rd massacre. Let's go on to you, Dr. Ahmed McLad. We're trying to get our head around the situation right now in Sudan. This case has cropped up all of a sudden. The acting general prosecutor has said he has been charged. The trial is expected to start as soon as next week. What do you make of this? Do you think this is something that would have been routine, or maybe just trying a form of distraction?
It's a joke, nothing more, nothing less. Omar al-Bashir has been responsible of the killing of thousands, hundreds of thousands in Sudan. And when they brought him to court today, they brought him for some, corrupt issues of finance. This is not what we've been calling for. He should be held for all the killing that happened in Sudan, not only for what's happening today. We see as if we lost all the lives that we lost through the protest for nothing. Omar al-Bashir is taken in a beautiful Land Cruiser, just like he is still the president, taken with all the protect, as someone who is still in charge. And they taken him for what? For some financial corruption? No, this is not what we're calling for. He admitted on live TV, the videos are still online available, that he was in charge of killing hundreds of thousands, 300,000 Darfuris. They are the Sudanese people in Western Sudan. So he admitted that. He gave the green light for the killing.
And there are arrest warrants out there, 2 arrest warrants, in fact. And yet at the time, he, in his tenure, been able to visit regional countries very freely without having to worry about being arrested.
And that's why we call it just a joke. Our protest didn't achieve what we want, and that's why we will continue. Yes, the military, the other face of the military, what we call the rapid forces or Hemeti forces, they've taken over the streets of Khartoum. We're not able to protest as we used to, but that does not mean that we're not in a protest state. We are still continuing to say no. People are doing disobedience, and we're still planning more and more. This country will not rest with a military rule.
Okay, right. Now let's bring in Mr. Rashid. Also, what your take on this is as the situation evolves, and also what was going on with the cases of 41 members in Bashir's cabinet who were also involved in corruption, them being brought in for trial. Do you see any silver lining in this scenario at all?
Well, thank you very much, Ayza. If it quacks like a duck, walks like a duck, it will not be a donkey. So those junta who took over on the 11th of April are the extension of the previous regime headed by the despot Omar al-Bashir. So we expect that they're not going easily without pressure to bring him to trial, because trying his regime is trying them as well. The Transitional Military Council is actually formed before the deposed president being taken off the helm by him as a security committee to safeguard his rule. So when they took over, you don't expect them to change completely. But what is happening now is a farce.
What's
Omar
happening?
al-Bashir, I mean, this mock trial they're trying to forge right now.
Right.
It is a mock trial.
What would have been, Mr. Rashid, what would have been the ideal move at a time where the world is condemning the military, the Sudanese military, for the massacre that's just taken place earlier this month? What would have been the right move, in your opinion?
Well, actually, when the Sudanese people pay these high prices for change, their main slogan is a civilian rule. Unless this been actualized on ground, we don't think that many of the things being twisted during these 30 years can be straightened up. So Omar al-Bashir under custody is the important thing. we do not want him to be indicted or being tried on these tribal crimes. His hands are actually stained with over 500,000 or almost 500,000 Sudanese. In Darfur alone, it is about 400,000. So this is, compared to what is being put in his trial, is really a mockery, and it is a farce.
Okay, so this is, I'm still fixating on Vi's words. You said what walks like a duck, talks like a duck, is a duck, can't be a donkey. But Dr. Asha, what in your opinion could be done at this point from the international community, considering the UN envoy is on the ground? He's trying to make conversation here. But the investigation in the June 3rd massacre, which should have been in the forefront as analysts are pushing, and as our guest has also said, this is a farce, what is going on with Umar al-Bashir. What is the reaction, in your opinion, of the international community? Is enough being done?
I think the committee that is formed is absolutely not accepted or respected, because we are demanding a very independent committee to investigate under international or observation. We do not actually trust the military council. We actually, it's the contrary, we are holding them responsible for the massacre. So there is no trust that they will carry a fair investigation. And they have actually admitted that they are responsible for this. Unfortunately, the military council, which I don't call it a transitional military council, it's just a military council that came to restore order, and actually it is the contrary. We do not have any security now or any order now, and they are assuming power that is not theirs. They are actually taking the responsibilities as if they are ruling the country. They are not in a position to hold trials. They are actually hold those trials under the same old regime, the same institution, the same judges. And I think any trial should be organized after we have a civilian government, after we have the new cabinet, which can actually be trusted and.
So you're saying basically not only is this a farce of a trial, don't even have the authority to do it. So let me ask you, Mr. McLad, when international community, the question of the international community, their efforts comes into play, the ICC, what have they done to get hold of Umar al-Bashir, apart from issuing the arrest warrants? If we are just to right now talk about Umar al-Bashir and the fact that he couldn't possibly face a fair trial in Sudan.
Well, that's one of the reasons why the Sudanese people are nowadays calling on each other that we're not, fully trusting the international community to make actual change in land. What we need to do is that we need to continue our own fight ourselves, because what happened is we see beautiful condemnation and reports and beautiful tweets on Twitter from high-profile politicians, and it will change nothing in the real life. The ICC, the International Criminal Court, they actually affected our economy by just putting the warrant there and not having it processed or done or made real. Affected our economy. Those who suffered are not al-Bashir and his troops, those who suffered, the actual Sudanese people. We suffer, our economy suffered, we suffered, and now when he is in jail, they didn't even bother asking about handing him for them. Okay, he's still, the whole world knows that he's a killer. He's the most corrupt dictator in the African continent that ruled for more than almost 30 years, and still nothing real happened in the real life. We still didn't see a real effort to change what's happening in Sudan now. Even
he's gone unarrested for 10 years, so that goes to show the international community has really done. absolutely nothing. But Mr. Rashid, apart from condemning the condemnations that have come from the international community on the genocide that's taken place in Darfur, what has happened in the past month alone, what serious efforts, in your opinion, the UN has made to address these issues in Sudan?
Well, I think there is, the efforts being exerted now are not enough and actually hampered by the vetoes of the heavyweights like China and Russia in the Security Council. And this shows that Sudan is a ping-pong table for the international affairs. People who has got vested interest to keep this weak despot and to be like a puppet, to be directed with tight ropes from somewhere outside. They want to keep him there. There is a lot of things happening in Sudan and around Sudan.
So what, if you could specify, Mr. Rashid, if you specify for our viewers quickly, what kind of role are these neighboring countries playing? And why is Sudan so important for them, for their proxy wars?
Well, namely UAE, Saudi Arabia and Egypt, they have got vested interest, although all of them are agreeing to keep the status quo in Sudan, but maybe there is a little bit different reason from Egypt to the Arab Gulf areas. And the international arena, China is actually extending its presence in Africa. Russia wants to have some foothold there as having camps and maybe having bases. The Sudan enjoys a very important view or focal point to the Red Sea. So those are playing, and the Sudanese are paying the price for that. International ICC, for example, in Sudan, our law does not cover genocide, crimes against humanity in this massive way, or ethnic cleansing. So this cannot be tried now unless we have our civilian government. Then we decide where.
Mr.
In
Rashid,
my own opinion, if it's tried inside Sudan, that will be, more severe than having these 5-star cells in Lahai.
Okay. So, Dr. Asha, there's a question of what Mr. Rashid has just said in terms of, is the Sudanese population ready, prepared, has the infrastructure, say, for that transition into a democratic system? Now, the military junta might have the support of those neighboring autocratic regimes, but within itself, within its borders, are they going to be able to step up and fill that vacuum?
You mean the military or the population?
I'm talking about the civilian population. Right now, the opposition parties all rallying together.
I think yes. Okay. I think, first of all, regarding the international community, let me say that we are expecting the international community to support the Sudanese people, not the Sudanese government. But this is just an expectation. We are not relying on them. The Sudanese people have stood against a very fierce military regime. They have taken it over. The revolution is still going on. It is not yet finished. We are now. When I say we, I mean the revolutionists and the people who are in the street, and mainly the youth who have led this revolution. I think we are relying on ourselves. We are relying on the real allies, and we are very much committed, to have the civilian government, regardless of the costs that have already been paid, and people are ready to pay more costs. I think we also have to say that the Sudan is very pivotal for the Arab wealth and also for Africa. And that's why it is very critical for some regimes like Egypt and Saudi Arabia not to have a democratic, plural democratic regime in Sudan. And that's why, in addition to their vested interest in the economic situation, they are really afraid of having a democratic regime in Sudan.
Because it might spread. It might spread like the Arab Spring did, and they might end up in the same boat. Stay with us. Let me quickly come to you, Dr. McLad. While Dr. Asha has confidence that we have to rely on ourselves, speaking of the Sudanese people, how much of this effort can come to fruition, considering there are regional countries like Uganda that are ready to offer asylum to Umar al-Bashir? So is this the kind of situation that would be constructed for a democratic setup?
Well, we learned from the previous revolutions in the neighborhood, and we know that countries that are, they have their own interest over the interest of the Sudanese people, and we know that the real change will only happen by the people of Sudan, inland on the Sudanese soil. Mm-hmm. There is nothing else, nothing more. All of the other things are additional, decorative changes. But what's happening that we know that Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, they are not in favor of what the Sudanese people wants. They're in favor of their own political agenda and their own, financial and economical interests in Sudan, and their own, status of no successful protest in the region, because that will give us a good example to their own people, which they don't like. We don't care about what they look for. We care about our people. The Sudanese people said one thing: we will not go back for a military rule. We had 30 years, enough with Al-Bashir.
Okay, so Mr. Rashid, we're running out of time. I want to quickly ask you to highlight the differences here for our viewers, because not all of them might be familiar with the sort of breakdown here, not only in the opposition parties who are supposed to be standing together fighting the military junta, but also the division that we see in terms of ideology. Now, this military junta was for the longest time led by the Islamist parties, right? So help us understand how this, or what our guests are also saying, that we need to sort of cut out international interference, we need to rely on our own people. How will this go forward with the kind of sort of divisions we are seeing at the moment?
This is a very important question, actually. Sudanese people actually under many banners, many political, ideological trajectories. But we have this agreed ceiling of the minimum required for us to prepare our country for proper democratic transfer of power and democratic practices. What we have actually agreed upon is the Declaration of Freedom and Change, which actually been signed by the majority of these groups. It is the professionals, civil society organizations, and the major political parties in Sudan, and some of the armed forces groups operating in different places of the civil war in Sudan. So this is blankly the most and the widest coalition of political parties. Of course, the remnants of the previous regime will try to keep a foothold. Mm-hmm. They have created through 3 decades a very deep state, and they wanted to be kept there in order to put the spanner in the works.
And they will do anything. And they will do anything to stay in power. We've come to the end of this part of the show. I'm really sorry we've had to cut you off there, Mr. Rashid, but we've run out of time. But thank you so much, Dr. Ahmed McLad, for joining us from Sydney, and also Dr. Asha and Mr. Rashid for your input there. We're going to take a quick short break. We'll be right back. Don't go away. Welcome back. You're watching Newswire with me, Ayza Omar. Now we're going to talk about something which is a little related to what we talked about earlier, Umar al-Bashir facing corruption charges in Sudan. But corruption itself is a social malice. It's a worldwide epidemic. It's going on irrespective of what the status of the country is on the development index. It's a crime that can bleed a country dry of its wealth on the hands of one or even a slew of leaders. it has been the reason behind the downfall of great statesmen, and it has been the source of enormous wealth for others. Now, the victim, however, remains the same, which is the state. The International Court of Justice reports, whether it's WikiLeaks, Panama Papers, all have one thing in common, and that is corruption by state leaders and their cronies, all of which would have gone unnoticed mostly or disproven anyway had it not been for whistleblowers like Julian Assange and others. We will be taking a look at the difficulties in proving corruption allegations and how possible is it to get back stolen wealth of the state. But most importantly, how do you set up a system in the world today where corruption can be caught first time round? So let me introduce our guests who will be talking to us about this topic. We have with us Ms. Kimberley Motley. She's an international lawyer joining us from Oslo. We also have Ms. Ilham Mohamed. She is the regional coordinator for Transparency International, and also Ravi Srivastav, an analyst who will be joining us. So welcome to the show. I want to start with you, Ms. Ilham. There has been several reports. They come out actually every year by Transparency International, and just the one in 2018 confirmed that there has been a sort of a stagnation on the corruption perceptions index for countries mostly. If anything, most of them have been on an average that shows that they haven't improved in terms of corruption. Give us a bit of the salient features of this report. What does it tell us about the situation in the world in terms of corruption?
Thank you, Ayza. This is especially true for the countries in Asia. What we are looking at when you look at the data is that despite a lot of governments in Asia coming to power on anti-corruption pledges, we're not seeing any movement on the index. What this means is that there has been not much done at a substantial level in making change on the ground. Our index also, it's a health check, so it gives an overview of where countries stand. What that means is that when you compare the Asian countries to other countries in other regions with similar economies, such as, say, comparing India to Brazil or other similar big economies, there's stagnation in Asia, which clearly is indicating that despite the talk, very little is moving on the ground.
So you talk about Asia a lot. What about other countries? Europe, as in the report it says, has done mostly pretty much the same. It's been on the good side. It's got a CPI index that shows the corruption is not as prevalent as in other regions. But then we look at numbers for the US, for example. It's out of the list for the top 20 countries that were least corrupt. It's now dropped 4 more points, I believe. What are the reasons behind that, do you think?
Again, as I said, the index is a comparison. So what this means is that even if you're on the top of the index, it doesn't necessarily mean that your country is like 100% clean. In the US, what we are seeing is a drop in the perception index, clearly associated with what is happening around the space for civil society and democracy in the country. If you look at our analysis for the global index as a whole, we've seen a clear link between lack of democracy or contraction in the democratic space with the space for anti-corruption activists to fight corruption. What this means is that countries are stuck in a vicious cycle where lack of democracy in turn affects the infrastructure or the anti-corruption infrastructure that is set up to make sure that the state is operating at a certain level of a clean economy. And once this space is restricted, you would see that decline naturally.
That's a really interesting point. That in the report by Transparency International on CPI, the corruption perception index highlights that there is some kind of correlation between the state of the democracy that the country is in and also the level of corruption there. But before we get into that, Ms. Kimberley, I want to bring in your expertise as an international lawyer. Something that Ms. Ilham said, that the infrastructure existing in countries around the world in order to sort of rein in corruption or catch it at least in its tracks. And here I talk about bank accounts, offshore companies, shell companies, through which money taken from the state, stolen from the state, can be easily parked. What are the kind of international law loopholes that allows that to continue unhindered?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, the corruption that takes place, particularly in the areas that that were studied, there's a lot of issues within the national laws, within the various jurisdictions. Like, for instance, with regards to Afghanistan. Obviously, my area of expertise is within the justice system, and I see that there's a real lack of motivation for people or prosecutors or judges or the rule of law to go after those individuals that are corrupt, that are really attacking the system in a very systemic way. Mostly those that are very well off. It's very unusual to have someone of wealth to actually be criminally charged with engaging in corruption, even when it's very glaring that they are engaging in such activities.
That's a really interesting point there, because you say it's very difficult to sort of have somebody of wealth and criminally charge them. But in a country like Afghanistan, which is right now geopolitically not only very important, but in terms of international relations, it's in the middle of US-Afghan-Taliban talks. I mean, this here is full of people who are important, playing very important roles, are stakeholders and regional actors in these Afghan peace talks. So obviously, if US is to play a role in, say, the anti-corruption drive, or other even humanitarian organizations, or organizations like the UN or the ICJ or the ICC are to play a role in sort of even in Afghanistan, particularly since that's where your area of expertise is right now, it would be very hard, wouldn't it, to put somebody on the sort of in court and charge them when they play a very big role in bringing peace to the region?
Unfortunately, it's not that it would be very hard to criminally charge them from a sort of elements of a crime standpoint. It's hard to charge them in the vein where people, frankly, aren't motivated, unfortunately, to charge them. You know, there's many prosecutors or people within rule of law who are very scared to go after persons of wealth or persons that have influences in different governmental entities. It shouldn't be like that, of course, but unfortunately, that's how it is, not just in Afghanistan, but frankly, around the world. And I see the graphics of some of the people that you're putting on your screen, where it's very difficult to go after some of these people because of the motivation of those that are in the power to charge them. And, you know, with corruption, of course, fuels a lot of bribery. It fuels a lot of things being done under the table, which, you know, we know happens, unfortunately, in Afghanistan and other countries, including the U.S.
So if we were to talk about, and I see here you say that people are afraid to sort of go after these people of wealth or in these strong positions. For example, like we were talking about Afghanistan, one of the reasons is they obviously do not have the support or the protection of this very state that they're going to prosecute.
Yes, that's very true. I mean, often government officials, like for instance with Afghanistan particularly, their anti-corruption court was just inaugurated in 2016. So it's a relatively new court that was started in 2016, and they have, within that time period, they've had very few prosecutions of people, government officials, which is who that court was intended to target, and especially the higher level government officials within that court. And a lot of that people attribute to that there is a lack of motivation, number one. Prosecutors are very afraid to go after people with power. There has been reports of people being paid under the table. There's been reports of prosecutors being threatened, things like that. So there is not just a financial issue that the prosecutors are scared about with going after people of power and people of wealth, but there are real significant safety issues that prosecutors, defense attorneys, and judges fear of sort of being involved in such cases.
Okay, so I want to come back to you, Ms. Ilham. I want to add another issue that came up related to corruption in democratic societies, something that the report highlights, and I want to get your take on this. So is it really the state of the democracy in a country that leads to more corruption, or is it that corruption already exists that in a way then affects democracy and makes it deteriorate?
I would say it's a cycle. It reinforces each other. the lack of democracy or the state of democracy or the deterioration there, what that does is it further disrupts the integrity systems that exists. And in cases where integrity systems don't exist, what that means is that there's very little political will to come up with strong institutions. Afghanistan is a very good example that you've taken up. One key issue, yes, we're talking about prosecuting grand corruption in Afghanistan, but one main issue there is that there lacks a lot of regular, boring anti-corruption infrastructure that would not necessarily be super useful to go after the big fish, but at the end of the day, ultimately a country needs a anti-corruption infrastructure that encompasses everything. So in many countries such as Afghanistan or Sudan, where you don't really have a strong state, what is also lacking is the regular, boring, everyday anti-corruption laws.
You keep saying boring as if it's something that comes in the way of its being effective. Is that the case?
No, it's just that I sometimes feel like when we have these discussions on anti-corruption, we're always talking about really high-level laws and catching the big fish, and the focus is very much on grand corruption. Whereas at the end of the day, if you're unable to tackle, like every country, wherever you are in the anti-corruption, the CPI index, every country needs an audit law. Every country needs a proper procurement system to procure, say, simple things such as procurement in the education ministry, for example. Yeah. However, when a lot of the discussion, as I said, is very much focused around procurement in the military or procurement for bigger infrastructure projects, that of course there's a scale element to it, but you also need very regular laws that don't make the news, such as right to information laws, such as basic audit laws, such as basic laws that set up bureaucracy, such as what would be a good example? Regulation around filing systems. Ultimately, these are the small micro institutions that keep a system in place. And once a grand prosecutor on grand corruption comes in, at the end of the day, these are the laws that would catch the big fish as well.
Right. I understand your point of view here. It should sort of almost start from the ground up and then not fixate over like the biggest fish in the sort of situation here. But it is the biggest fish that takes home the biggest stake from the stolen wealth pie of corruption. I mean, we are talking about some of the images that we were showing are of presidents and leaders of countries where there has been a lot of civil strife and there has been a complete lack of international sort of forums or institutions that might have helped in recovering this wealth. And here, Ms. Kimberley, if you could comment on this, the role that a sort of the ICJ might have in this, or the UN might have in this, the Security Council, in sort of either putting sanctions or bringing to trial the leaders of countries where already there is so much internal strife that you cannot depend on the internal systems to bring them to justice.
Yes, I absolutely agree with what you're saying. The ICJ and the UN, they definitely need to step more up to the plate in making sure that people are found or countries are found accountable for their corrupt practices. I mean, they have a responsibility if they're going to sort of fund different countries such as Afghanistan for anti-corruption measures. And if they fail in this regard, they have a responsibility to do something about it, step in on it. Now, I would say that there are the laws that are in place that would allow for them to do it, but for whatever reason, they are failing to act upon it. And it is very disconcerting because they do have a responsibility of it. But I think sort of the silver lining is if you look at, places like Hong Kong, for instance, where there was obviously millions and millions of citizens that basically protested against the government, and it did sort of affect change. That, frankly, seems to be something that works, that you can't really, unfortunately, rely on the UN. You can't rely on the ICJ. And it is really ultimately up to the citizens to stand up to governments and say, we're not going to take this. We're not going to take corruption, because systems and laws are often in place that the government is choosing to ignore.
Okay. And very quickly, Ms. Ilham, if you can just get a quick response on this. The report also showed there's a strong link between healthy democracy and successfully fighting public sector corruption here. Is this something, or what you were referring to earlier, that it might just be where we need to work more internally?
Yes, definitely. Public sector corruption, the main thing about public sector corruption is, yes, as you said, the big fish takes the biggest volume in terms of the monetary value we're looking at. But at the end of the day, the most vulnerable victims of corruption are the citizens that are unable to access government services. And this is a huge concern for Transparency International, as well as our chapters on the ground. The fact that corruption affects the poor and the vulnerable more.
Absolutely.
And for us to combat that, having local solutions that cater to the needs of as many people on the ground as possible is key.
All right. Thank you so much, Ms. Ilham, there from Transparency International, talking to us about the Corruption Perceptions Index of 2018. Coming back to you, Ms. Kimberley, again, I want to talk a little about the role that international forums could play and should be playing. I mean, let's just talk about, we were talking about Sudan earlier on in the first half of this show, how Omar Al-Bashir, the former president, is now facing corruption charges. And this is a trial that is going on internally. But let's not forget that the ICC has already, in the past 10 years, issued 2 arrest warrants for this person. And he has been able to travel to Syria, to Ethiopia, and other neighboring countries without any kind of fear of being arrested. So there's obviously a fault in the system, whether it's implementation or is it the very laws itself that are at fault?
I think the issue is really implementation, unfortunately. I think there's like I said, a real lack of motivation from sometimes, unfortunately, the ICC, but also national courts to go after these very powerful persons within the governments. You know, it is ridiculous that a person is traveling around and they have a warrant with the ICC. It makes the institution itself lose a lot of credibility. And so I do believe that there needs to be more measures for instance, the Security Council or people within the UN to step up to the plate to try to make sure that these corrupt actors are moving forward and to, where they can, to take the politics out of it and just look at these people, no matter what their position, as, you know, accused people or defendants, as opposed to, oh, this person is a leader of X country. And so I think that that has significantly failed within the international criminal courts, unfortunately. But obviously, there's always room for improvement. So hopefully, moving forward, you know, we can always hope that the UN will take more of a primary role in making sure that corrupt actors and the warrants that, for instance, ICC makes are actually followed through on, because they just lose credibility as an institution themselves. And what ends up happening is they look like they're part of the situation. They look like they're part of fueling corruption within the countries, unfortunately.
Okay. All right. So here I'd like to welcome the guest who's just joining us. His expertise is in reporting on corruption cases, exposés. And this is Mr. Ravi Srivastav. He's an analyst. He's joining us from Mumbai. Welcome to Newsbar. It's so good to have you. We're talking about essentially how there has been a failure, not just internally within countries itself, but also internationally on the forums who should be responsible for for taking to task individuals who are responsible for leading a country and carrying out a basic government sort of work when they're charged for corruption, to take them to task. So tell us a little, in your experience, where is it where the system fails? Is it an internal problem, essentially, how corruption is not been able to be reined in?
Corruption is a global phenomenon, and India is no exception. I will tell you my take on that how did I expose the corruption. I was a whistleblower working for a government-owned oil company, and I was responsible for supply chain, logistics, and all those things. I found there was corruption in purchase of a certain chemical by the company. And these things happen because all these government oil companies are owned by the government primarily. They have got 80 to 90% shareholding in the government companies. And primarily this corruption is initiated at the level of the petroleum minister, the prime minister, the top bureaucrats. Those are the people who are involved in it. And the people who are the whistleblowers who expose this kind of corruption, they are taken to task, and they are literally tortured by the managements of the day, and they see to it that they are removed out of the system. They are sacked. They are put with different kind of
So there's no protection for the whistleblowers, despite the fact that India did sort of take part in creating an act that essentially provided protection to whistleblowers, didn't it?
Absolutely, you are right. There is absolutely no protection for if you expose any wrongdoing within your corporation. And the same thing is applicable in the corporates also. Yep. Because if somebody exposes the corruption, he immediately becomes a persona non grata. Unlike USA or UK or other developed countries in Europe, there is absolutely no protection for such people. And the government and the corporates see them as a bottleneck, or as a people who are trying to stop their work or their well-oiled machinery of corruption. They are seen as a impediment to that.
But Mr. Ravi, let's talk a little about your experience personally as a whistleblower for this oil company. What happened to you once you blew the lid off on what kind of corruption was taking place within the ranks?
I had exposed in 2008-2009 a corruption of some 200 crore, which was done at the behest of then Petroleum Minister. He is no more alive. I would not like to name him, but he was the person who was involved in that corruption. And what they did, they imported a product from UK, Messrs. Authentics. The company name was Authentics, and they had they were importing a product to be mixed with the Indian at the Indian petrol pumps in the diesel and petrol to check the adulteration, in the name of checking the adulteration. And that product was nobody knew that product, what is the actual cost of that product. It could have been even 10 rupees a litre. But these guys purchased it at some 13,000 rupees per litre, and crores of worth of product was purchased in India, and they tried to circulate it on the petrol pumps, and people were exploiting. They appointed a private agency to check on the petrol pumps, and they were trying to, those people were indulging in corruption.
So very quickly, Mr. Ravi, we're last minute, just very quickly, what was the result? Do you feel satisfied that after reporting this, do you feel like those who were responsible were brought to justice?
My complaint to the Central Bureau of Investigation of India proved that there was corruption, and those oil company top officials were taken to task. For the rest of my life, I will live with that feeling that I was vindicated. I had done a right thing. I had saved the nation, irrespective of what kind of torture or the loss of pride I suffered in the hands of those corrupt managements. That is a different thing. But then
it comes at a personal price. You do stand vindicated, but it does come at a personal price, Mr. Ravi, and we're really glad that you came out of that safe and alive, because not the same is what happens to whistleblowers around the world. We are seeing at the moment, as the world is reporting on the plight of whistleblowers, for example, Julian Assange himself, Chelsea Manning, those who have, for the sake of their countries, tried to report corruption or espionage or acts committed by the government itself against the very people that they're supposed to protect. And with that, we've run out of time, so we've come to the end of our show. I'd just like to thank you, Ms. Kimberley, for your insight on international law, on how corruption is not been able to be reined in. And of course, Mr. Ravi, for giving us your time. And with that, we'll see you tomorrow. Till then, goodbye.